The day the Three Gorges Dam failed began, as many tragedies do, with small, almost mundane things that no single person could tie together until after the fact. A barometer reading slightly higher than normal at a hydrology station upriver. A foreman who called in sick. A shift in the scheduling software that pushed a routine inspection out by 48 hours, and the odd, low hum that a tugboat pilot later remembered feeling under his feet as he steered past the western bank before dawn. These tiny discrepancies braided into a rope that would snap under weight. For weeks, the sky had been bruised with rains declared by weather services to be exceptional, but not unprecedented. Storms that hung over the Yangtze like a damp blanket, feeding the reservoir until the water lapped at its designed limits, and then beyond. Indeed, and beyond. And while the dam's concrete heart was built to resist the lazy, seasonal pressures of flood and drought alike, there are kinds of strain no blueprint fully anticipates. Earth that shifts in secret after the machines leave. Welds that carry microscopic fatigue from months of humming turbines. Ands, Ds, Ands. Guardians who grow confident in the machinery they inherit, and political currents that prize output, and optics over the slow, costly business of upkeep. In the small hours before the collapse, the dam's monitoring screens told different, inconsistent stories. Some sensors registering a steady rise in seepage at a secondary joint. Others reporting a vibration pattern slightly outside spec, While at control room, a tired technician dismissed a blinking light as a false alarm and toggled it off out of habit across the river in a sleepy riverside town. An old woman who had watched the reservoir swell since her childhood stirred from a dream of a wall of water and, unsettled, went to her window to watch the lights on the dam like a child counting stars. The official weather alerts that morning spoke in measured language, heavy rains, caution advised, and the news feeds broadcast footage of farmers stacking sandbags, children carried to higher ground by teachers who hugged them like frightened birds. And fleet managers idling their ships in harbors as tug crews argued with managers over whether to evacuate to secondary slips, all decisions that would later be weighed like stones in the scales of blame. At 9:14 local time, sound began in the heart of the structure. Not one dramatic crack, but a growing orchestra of small betrayals. The sibilant hiss of under-pressure water, finding new passages, the metallic groan of turbine housings that had turned for decades, the subtle creak of concrete adapting to a stress it had not been built to bear in such quick succession. The first outward sign came as a thin, violent spray at a downstream spillway where maintenance divers had last inspected the bolts 3 years earlier. The spray was small, a drama of droplets against the morning light, but within minutes those droplets multiplied into a cataract as hidden, seams flushed with water and widened, their mouths devouring bolts and concrete until whole panels went missing. And where the water found purchase it scoured concrete and rebar into groaning, flaking measurements of failure. The emergency alarm system, blinking red in offices, shrilling in corridors, repeating canned phrases in different dialects, began to stutter as power surged and then failed in pockets, and shell-shocked dispatchers tried to send orders that traveled like whispers through static. Close sluice gates, flew static. Close sluice gates, release controlled flows, initiate evacuation protocols for downstream settlements. Protocols met reality with a stubborn friction. The remote control mechanisms on several gates froze under torque. They had never expended, apparently fused by a pressure spike and a microfracture that joined with a corrosion problem only a specialist would have recognized, while engineers at the central command frantically toggled manual overrides, their gloved fingers trembling from fatigue and adrenaline. Disney. By the time the first measured breach opened, a rectangular wound where concrete had been a living thing 20 minutes before. Whole neighborhoods below the dam were already receiving automated flood warnings on their phones. Their tones, like a sudden, terrible drumbeat that summoned people to the streets in pajamas and work uniforms alike. Boats in the reservoir, cargo barges drifting from ports, fishermen who had come to check nets, pleasure cruisers packed with tourists who had paid for the sunrise, found the water distorting in ways they could not read. They could not read. Eddies formed in minutes where there had been calm, currents swallowing small craft like throatfuls of air in depth. From the observation platform, a chief engineer named Lai, who had spent half his life on this project and whose father had helped pour silos of the concrete that held back the river, watched the instruments go red and felt a sensation of vertigo so deep it made his stomach lurch. He thought in what would become a painful memory of his father telling him that true stability is not the absence of motion, but the capacity to absorb it. And he found that words had been insufficient training downstream in the long ribbon of cities and towns that clung to the Yangtze's banks. Children were pulled from schoolyards by teachers who shouted over rising wind that carried the smell of wet earth and oil. A market vendor turned in time to see his stack of crates topple as the ground trembled, and an elderly man who had survived wartime bombing understood the look of a town about to be unmade. The initial wall of water that slipped through the breach was not a single monstrous wave from fairy tales, but a compound surge. First, a rising of the river that seemed to take everything slowly, a sullen lift that soaked the soles of shoes and seeped into basements as people looked on in confused calm. Then, after a terrible suspended breath, the river rearranged itself into forward motion, roaring faster, carrying cars like driftwood and uprooting trees as if they were toys. Bridges that had been monuments to engineering snapped where joints had taken the bite of that first surge and could not move. Power pylons bent and toppled, snatching at their cables like weeds in a current, and entire separate slate no more needs of